Hey everyone, and welcome back to our chapter book read along of The Borrowers. We are now on chapter 9, and I want to first go over a little bit of what's happened in our book so far. So, we are learning about a family of borrowers. Their last name is the Clocks because they live under the clock. What is a borrower? Tiny little people who live in old houses and they borrow things from the big people who live there. We have 3 in our little family, Pod, Humley, and Soarietti. They are currently in an old house where an older woman named Aunt Sophia lives, but she is bound to her bed and sickly. So the only other people who are there are a cook, a maid, a gardener, and now another little boy. Now, Soarietti has finally gotten to be able to go out and borrow, which was quite the argument because Pod was seen by the little boy. He was climbing up a curtain and got stuck, and luckily the boy came over and helped him get down. But they are very worried about being seen because sometimes people might mistake them for an infestation of rats or something, and they call the exterminator or get a cat. So they are being very careful, and Soarietti went out with Pod to go and borrow. The thing is she's been living under floorboards her entire life. So as soon as she saw the open grass and beautiful sky, she had to go out there and see it. So last we saw Miss Soarietti, she was out in the grass using a flower as an umbrella and walking along, but something was behind her. Let's see what that something was. Chapter 9. It was an eye, or it looked like an eye, clear and bright like the color of the sky, an eye like her own, but enormous, a glaring eye. Breathless with fear, she sat up, and the eye blinked. A great fringe of lashes came curving down and flew up again out of sight. Cautiously, Soarietti moved her legs. She would slide noiselessly in among the grass stems and slither away down the bank. "Don't move," said a voice, and the voice, like the eye, was enormous, but somehow hushed, a hoarse-like surge of wind through the grating on a stormy night in March. Soarietti froze. So this is it, she thought. The worst and most terrible thing of all. I've been seen. Whatever happened to Eglatina will now most certainly happen to me. There was a pause, and Soarietti, her heart pounding in her ears, heard the breath again drawn swiftly into the vast lungs. "Oh," the voice said, whispering still, "I shall hit you with my ash stick." Suddenly, Soarietti became calm. "Why?" she asked. How strange her own voice sounded. Crystal thin and harebell clear, it tickled the air. "In case," came the surprised whisper at last. "You ran toward me, quickly through the grass. In case," it went on, trembling a little. "You came and scrambled at me with your nasty little hands." Soarietti stared at the eye. She held herself quite still. "Why?" she asked again, and again the world twinkled. Icy cold, it sounded this time, and needle sharp. "Things do," said the voice. "I've seen them in India." Soarietti thought of the gazetteer of the world. "You're not in India now," she pointed out. "Did you come out of the house?" he said. "Yes," said Soarietti. "From whereabouts in the house?" Soarietti stared at the eye. "I'm not going to tell you," she said at last, bravely. Soarietti stared at the eye. "Then I'll hit you with my ash stick." "All right," said Soarietti. "Hit me." "I'll pick you up and break you in half." Soarietti stood up. "All right," she said, and took 2 paces forward. There was a sharp gasp and an earthquake in the grass. He spun away from her and sat up, a great mountain in a green jersey. He had fair, straight hair and golden eyelashes. "Stay where you are," he cried. Soarietti stared up at him. So this was the boy. Breathless she felt and light with fear. I guess you're about 9, she gasped after a moment. He flushed. Well, you're wrong. I'm 10. He looked down at her, breathing deeply. How old are you? 14, said Soarietti. Next June, she added, watching him. There was silence while Soarietti waited, trembling a little. Can you read? The boy said at last. Of course, said Soarietti. Can't you? No, he stammered. I mean, yes. I just came from India. What's that got to do with it? Asked Soarietti. Well, if you're born in India, you're bilingual. And if you're bilingual, you can't read not so well. Soarietti stared up at him. What a monster, she thought, dark against the sky. Do you grow out of it? She asked. He moved a little, and she felt the cold flick of his shadow. Oh, yes, it wears off. My sisters were bilingual, and now they aren't a bit. They could read any of the books upstairs in the schoolroom. So could I, said Soarietti quickly, if someone could hold them and turn the pages. I'm not a bit bilingual. I can read anything. Could you read out loud? Of course, said Soarietti. Would you wait here while I run upstairs and get a book now? Well, said Soarietti. She was longing to show off, and then a startled look came into her eyes. Oh, she faltered. What's the matter? The boy was standing up now. He towered above her. How many doors are there to this house? She squinted up at him against the bright sunlight. He dropped onto one knee. Doors? He said. Outside doors? Yes. Well, there's the front door, the back door, the gunroom door, the kitchen door, the scullery door, and the French windows in the drawing room. Well, you see, said Soarietti, my father's in the hall by the front door working. He wouldn't want to be disturbed. Working? Said the boy. What at? Getting material, said Soarietti, for a scrubbing brush. Then I'll go to the side door. He began to move away, but turned suddenly and came back to her. He stood a moment as though embarrassed, and then he said, Can you fly? No, said Soarietti, a bit surprised. Can you? His face became even redder. Of course not, he said angrily. I'm not a fairy. Well, nor am I, said Soarietti. Nor is anybody. I don't believe in them. He looked at her strangely. You don't believe in them? No, said Soarietti. Do you? Of course not, he said. Really, she thought. He was a very angry kind of boy. My mother believes in them, she said, trying to appease him. She thinks she saw one once. It was when she was a girl and lived with her parents behind the sand pile in the potting shed. He squatted down on his heels, and she felt his breath on her face. What was it like? He asked. About the size of a glowworm with wings like a butterfly. It had a tiny little face, she said, all alight and moving like sparks and tiny moving hands. Its face was changing all the time, she said, smiling and sort of shimmering. It seemed to be talking, she said, very quickly, and you couldn't hear a word. Oh, said the boy, interested. After a moment, he asked, Where'd it go? It just went, said Soarietti. When my mother saw it, it seemed to become caught in a cobweb. It was dark at the time, about 5 o'clock on a winter's evening, after tea. Oh, he said again, and picked up 2 petals of cherry blossom, which he folded together like a sandwich and ate slowly. Supposing, he said, staring past her at the wall of the house, you saw a little man, about as tall as a pencil, with blue patch in his trousers, halfway up a window curtain, carrying a doll's teacup. Would you say it was a fairy? No, said Soarietti. I'd say that was my father. Oh, the boy said, thinking this out. Does your father have a blue patch on his trousers? Not in his best trousers. He does on his borrowing ones. Oh, said the boy again. He seemed to fit it a safe sound, as lawyers do. Are there many people like you? No, said Soarietti. None. We're all different. I mean as small as you. Soarietti laughed. Oh, don't be silly, she said. Surely you don't think there are many people in the world your size? There are more people my size than yours, he retorted. Honestly, began Soarietti helplessly and laughed again. Do you really think? I mean, whatever sort of a world would it be? Those great chairs, I've seen 'em. Fancy if you had to make chairs that size for everyone. And the stuff for their clothes, miles and miles of it, tents of it, and the sewing. And their great houses reaching up so you can hardly see the ceilings, their great beds, the food they eat, great smoky mountains of it, huge bogs of stew and soup and stuff. Don't you eat soup? Asked the boy. Of course we do, laughed Soarietti. My father had an uncle who had a little boat which he rowed around in the stock pot, picking up flotsam and jetsam. He did bottom fishing, too, for bits of marrow until he got suspicious by finding bent pins in his soup. Once he was nearly shipwrecked on a chunk of submerged shinbone. He lost his oars and the boat sprang a leak, but he flung a line over the pot handle and pulled himself along the rim. But all that stock, fathoms of it, the size of the stock pot. I mean, there wouldn't be enough stuff in the world to go round after a bit. That's why my father says it's a good thing they're dying out. Just a few, my father says. That's all we need to keep us. Otherwise, he says the whole thing gets... Soarietti hesitated, trying to remember the word. Exaggerated, he says. What do you mean? Asked the boy. To keep us. Chapter 10. So Soarietti told him about borrowing, how difficult it was and how dangerous. She told him about the storerooms under the floor, about Pod's early exploits, the skill he had shown, the courage. She described those far-off days before her birth, when Pod and Homily had been rich. She described the musical snuff-box and gold filigree, and the little bird which flew out of it made of kingfisher feathers, how it flapped its wings and sang its song. She described the doll's wardrobe and the tiny green glasses, and the little silver teapot out of the drawing-room case, and the satin bed covers and embroidered sheets. Those we have still, she told him. They are her handkerchiefs. She, the boy realized gradually, was his great-aunt Sophie upstairs, bedridden since a hunting accident some 20 years before. He heard how Pod would borrow from her room, picking his way, in the firelight, among the trinkets on her dressing table, even climbing her bed curtains and walking on her quilt. And now, if she would watch him and sometimes talk to him, because Soarietti explained, every day at 6 o'clock, they brought her a decanter of fine old pale Madeira, and how before midnight she would drink the lot. Nobody blamed her, not even Homily, because, as Homily would say, she had so few pleasures, poor soul. But Soarietti explained, after the first 3 glasses, Great-Aunt Sophie never believed in anything she saw. She thinks my father comes out of the decanter, said Soarietti, and one day, when I'm older, he's going to take me there, and she'll think I came out of the decanter too. It'll please her, my father thinks, as she's used to him now. Once he took my mother, and she perked up like anything and kept asking after her and why she didn't come anymore, and saying they've watered the Madeira down because once she says she saw a little man and a little woman, and now she only sees a little man. I wish she thought I came out of the decanter, said the boy. She gives me dictation and teaches me to write. I only see her in the mornings when she's cross. She sends for me and looks behind my ears and asks Mrs. D if I've learned my words. What's Mrs. D look like? Asked Soarietti. How delicious it was to say Mrs. D like that. How careless and daring. She's fat and has a mustache and gives me my bath and hurts my bruise and my sore elbow and says she'll take a slipper to me one of these days. The boy pulled up a tuft of grass and stared at it angrily, and Soarietti saw his lip tremble. My mother's very nice, he said. She lives in India. Why did you lose all your worldly riches? Well, said Soarietti, the kitchen boiler burst and hot water came pouring through the floor into our house, and everything was washed away and piled up in front of the grating. My father worked night and day, first hot, then cold, trying to salvage things. And there's a dreadful drought in March through the grating. He got ill, you see, and couldn't go borrowing. So my uncle Harandiri had to do it, and 1 or 2 others, and my mother gave them things bit by bit for all the trouble. But the kingfisher bird got spoiled by the water, all its feathers fell off. and Great Twirling Spring came jumping off its side. My father used the spring to keep the door shut against the drafts from the grating, and my mother put the feathers in a little moleskin hat. After a while, I was born, and my father went borrowing again, but he gets tired now and doesn't like curtains, not when any of the baubles are off. I helped him a bit, said the boy, with the teacup. He was shivering all over. I suppose he was frightened. My father was frightened, exclaimed Soarietti angrily. Frightened of you, she added. Perhaps he doesn't like heights, said the boy. He loves heights, said Soarietti. The thing he doesn't like is curtains. I told you, curtains make him tired. The boy sat thoughtfully on his haunches, chewing a blade of grass. Borrowing, he said after a while. Is that what you call it? What else would you call it? Asked Soarietti. I call it stealing. Soarietti laughed. She really laughed. But we are borrowers, she explained. Like you're a human being, or whatever it's called. We're part of the house. You might as well say that the fire grate steals the coal from the coal scuttle. Then what is stealing? Soarietti looked grave. Don't you know? She asked. Stealing is, well, supposing my Uncle Harandery borrowed an emerald watch from her dressing table and my father took it and hung it up on our wall. That's stealing. An emerald watch, exclaimed the boy. Well, I just said that because we have one on the wall at home, but father borrowed it himself. It needn't be a watch, it could be anything, a lump of sugar even. But borrowers don't steal. Except from human beings, said the boy. Soarietti burst out laughing. She laughed so much that she had to hide her face in the primrose. Oh dear, she gasped with tears in her eyes. You are funny. She stared up toward his puzzled face. Human beings are for borrowers, like breads for butter. The boy was silent for a while. A sigh of wind rustled the cherry tree and shivered among the blossoms. Well, I don't believe it, he said at last, watching the falling petals. I don't believe that's what we're for at all, and I don't believe we're dying out. Oh, goodness, exclaimed Soarietti impatiently, staring up at his chin. Just use your common sense. You're the only real human being I've ever saw. Although I do just know 3 more, Crumple, her, and Mrs. Driver. But I know lots and lots of borrowers. The overmantels and the harpsichords and the rain barrels and the linen presses and the boot racks and the hon, John Scuddingtons, and he looked down. John Scuddington? But he was our grand uncle. Well, his family lived behind a picture, went on Soarietti, hardly listening. And there were the stovepipes and the bell pulls and the... Yes, he interrupted. But did you see them? I saw the harpsichords, and my mother was a bell pull, and the others were before I was born. He leaned closer. Then where are they now? Tell me that. My Uncle Harandery has a house in the country, said Soarietti coolly, edging away from his great lowered face. It was misted over, she noticed, with hairs of classic gold, and 4 children, harpsichords and clocks. But where are the others? Oh, said Soarietti, they're somewhere. But where, she wondered, and she shivered slightly at the boy's cold shadow, which lay about her, slantwise on the grass. He drew back again, his fair head blocking out a great piece of sky. Well, he said deliberately after a moment, and his eyes were cold. I've only seen 2 borrowers, but I've seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. Oh no, whispered Soarietti. Of human beings. He sat back. Soarietti stood very still. She did not look at him. After a while, she said, I don't believe you. All right, he said. Then I'll tell you. I still won't believe you, murmured Soarietti. Listen, he said. And he told her about the railway stations and the football matches and the race courses and royal processions and Albert Hall concerts. He told her about India and China and North America and the British Commonwealth. He told her about the July sales. Not hundreds, he said, but thousands and millions and billions and trillions of great, big, enormous people. Now do you believe me? Ariadne stared up at him with frightened eyes. It gave her a crick in the neck. I dunno, she whispered. As for you, he went on, leaning closer again, I don't believe that there are any more borrowers anywhere in the world. I believe you're the last 3, he said. Ariadne dropped her face into the primrose. We're not. There's Aunt Lumpy and Uncle Dearie and my cousins. I bet they're dead, he said. And what's more, he went on, no one will ever believe I've seen you. And you'll be the very last because you're the youngest. One day, he told her, smiling triumphantly, you'll be the only borrower left in the world. He sat still, waiting, but she did not look up. Now you're crying, he remarked after a moment. They're not dead, said Ariadne in a muffled voice. She was feeling in her little pocket for a handkerchief. They lived in a badger's 2 fields away, beyond the spinney. We don't see them because it's too far. There are weasels and things, and cows and foxes and crows. Which spinney? He asked. I don't know, she almost shouted. It's along by a gas pipe, a field called Parkin's Beck. She blew her nose. I'm going home, she said. Don't go, he said. Not yet. Yes, I'm going, said Ariadne. His face turned pink. Let me just get the book, he pleaded. I'm not going to read to you now, said Ariadne. Why not? She looked up at him with angry eyes. Because, listen, he said, I'll go to that field. I'll go and I'll find Uncle Dearie and the cousins and Aunt whatever she is. And if they're alive, I'll tell you. What about that? You could write them a letter and I could put it down the hole. Ariadne gazed up at him. Would you? She breathed. Yes, I would. Really, I would. Now, can I go and get the book? I'll go down the side door. All right, said Ariadne absently. Her eyes were shining. When can I give you the letter? Any time, he said, standing above her. Where in the house do you live? Well, began Ariadne and stopped. Why once again did she feel this chill? Could it only be his shadow, towering above her, blotting out the sun? I'll put it somewhere, she said hurriedly. I'll put it under the hall mat. Which one? The one by the front door? Yes, that one. He was gone, and she stood there alone in the sunshine, shoulder deep in the grass. What had happened seemed too big for thought. She felt unable to believe it really had happened. Not only had she been seen, but she had been talked to. Not only had she been talked to, but she had... Ariadne! Said a voice. She stood up, startled, and spun around. There was Pod, moon-faced on the path, looking up at her. Come on down, he whispered. She stared at him for a moment as though she did not recognize him. How round his face was, how kind, how familiar. Come on, he said again, more urgently. And obediently, because he sounded worried, she slithered quickly toward him off the bank, balancing her primrose. Put that thing down, he said sharply, when she stood at last beside him on the path. Can't lug great flowers about. You got to carry a bag. What do you want to go up there for? He grumbled as they moved up across the stones. I might never have seen you. Hurry up now, your mother'll have tea waiting. Chapter 11. Homily was there at the last gate to meet them. She had tidied her hair and smelled of coal tar soap. She looked younger and somehow excited. Well, she kept saying, well, taking the bag from Ariadne and helping Pod to fasten the gate. Well, was it nice? Were you a good girl? Was the cherry tree out? Did the clock strike? She seemed, in the dim light, to be trying to read the expression on Ariadne's face. Come along now, tea's all ready. Give me a hand. Tea was indeed ready, laid on the round table in the sitting room with a bright fire burning on a cogwheel. How familiar the room seemed, and homely, but suddenly somehow strange. The firelight flickering on the wallpaper, the line which read, It would be so charming if. If what? Ariadne always wondered. If our house were less dark, she thought, that would be charming. She looked at the homemade dips set in upturned drawing pins, which Homily had placed as candle holders among the tea things, the old teapot, a hollow oak apple, with its quill spout and wired on a handle, burnished it was now and hard with age. There were 2 roast sliced chestnuts, which they would eat like toast with butter, and a cold boiled chestnut, which Pod would cut like bread. There was a plate of hot dried currants, well plumped before the fire. There were cinnamon breadcrumbs, crispy and golden, and lightly dredged with sugar. And in front of each place, oh, delight of delights, a single potted shrimp. Homily had put out the silver plates, the florin ones for herself and Soarietti, and the half-crown one for Pod. "Come along, Soarietti, you have to wash your hands," exclaimed Homily, taking up the teapot. "Don't dream." Soarietti drew up a cotton spool and sat down slowly. She watched her mother pulling out the spot of the teapot. This was always an interesting moment. The thicker end of the quill being inside the teapot, a slight pull just before pouring would draw it tightly into the hole and thus prevent a leak. If, as sometimes happened, a trace of dampness appeared about the join, it only meant a rather harder pull and a sudden gentle twist. "Well," said Homily, gingerly pouring, "tell us what you saw." "She didn't see much," said Pod, cutting himself a slice of boiled chestnut to eat with the shrimp. "Did you see the overmantel?" "No," said Pod. "We never went into the morning room." "What about my blotting paper?" "I never got it," said Pod. "Now, that's a nice thing," began Homily. "Maybe," said Pod, munching steadily, "but I had me feeling. I had it bad." "What's that?" asked Soarietti. "His feeling?" "Up the back of his head and in his fingers," said Homily. "It's a feeling a father gets when—" She dropped her voice. "There's someone about." "Oh," said Soarietti, and seemed to shrink. "That's why I brought her along home," said Pod. "And was there anyone?" asked Homily anxiously. Pod took a mouthful of shrimp. "Must have been," he said, "but I didn't see nothing." Homily leaned across the table. "Did you have that feeling, Soarietti?" Soarietti stared. "Oh," she said, "do we all have it?" "Well, not in the same place," said Homily. "Mine starts at the back of me ankles and then me knees go. My mother, hers used to start just under her chin and run around her neck." "And tied in a bow at back," said Pod, munching. "No, Pod," protested Homily. "It's a fact. No need to be sarcastic. All the bell pulls were like that, like a collar, she said it was." "Pity you didn't choke her," said Pod. "Now, Pod, be fair. She had her points." "Points," said Pod. "She was all points." Soarietti moistened her lips. She glanced nervously from Pod to Homily. "I didn't feel anything," she said. "Well," said Homily, "perhaps it was a false alarm." "Oh, no," began Soarietti. "It wasn't—" And as Homily glanced at her sharply, she faltered. "I mean, if Papa felt something, I mean, perhaps," she went on, "I don't have it." "Well," said Homily, "you are young. It'll come all in good time. You go and stand in our kitchen just up under the chute when Mrs. Driver's raking out the stove upstairs. Stand right up on a stool or something, so you're fairly near the ceiling. It'll come with practice." After tea, when Pod had gone to his workbench and Homily was washing up, Soarietti rushed to her diary. "I'll just open it," she thought, trembling with haste. "Anywhere." It fell open on the 9th and 10th of July. "Talk of campus and stay at home. Old Cambrian colours in Glasgow Cathedral, 1885. That's what it said on the 9th. And on the 10th, the page was headed, "Make hay while the sun shines. Snowdon Peak sold for $5,750, 1889. Soarietti tore out the last page. Turning it over, she read on the reverse side, "July 11th, make not a toil of your pleasure. Niagara passed by C.D. Graham in a cask, 1886. No," she thought, "I'll choose the 10th. Make hay while on the sun shines." And crossing out her last entry, Mother out of sorts, she wrote below it. Dear Uncle Heron Dearie, I hope you are quite well, and the cousins are well, and Aunt Luppy. We are very well, and I'm learning to borrow. Your loving niece, Soarietti Clock. Write a letter in on the back, please. What are you doing, Soarietti? Called Homily from the kitchen. Writing in my diary. Oh, said Homily shortly. Anything you want? Asked Soarietti. It'll do later. Soarietti folded the letter and placed it carefully between the pages of Bryce's Tom Thumb Gazetteer of the World, and in the diary she wrote, Went borrowing, wrote to H, talked to P. After that, Soarietti sat for a long time staring into the fire and thinking and thinking and thinking. Well, that is where we are going to end our story for today. Let's go over a few discussion questions. How does Soarietti meet the boy? Well, she is out borrowing, and while she's out in the lawn, she literally just kind of bumps into him. All she sees is a great big giant eye. Soarietti thinks that borrowing is normal. What does the boy call it? He calls it stealing. Well, yeah, I guess so. But it never leaves the house. What does bilingual mean? As in from the chapter where he says, well, if you're born in India, you're bilingual. Bilingual means you can speak 2 languages. So he can probably speak English and Indian. That was weird. Bilingual means you can speak 2 languages. This might make it hard for him to learn to read just one language, since he kind of has 2 different ones going in his brain. So that might be why it's difficult for him to read. Why does Pod let Great Aunt Sophie see him, but no one else? What do you think? Well, when does she see him? When Great Aunt Sophie has had a little too much to drink, and she thinks that he is a small man that came out of the bottle. So that's, no one else is going to believe her that there's someone there. So that's why he gets to see her. At the first meeting, the boy tells Soarietti something that upsets her. What was it? Well, Soarietti is talking about how she doesn't think there's very many humans because she's only ever seen 4 or heard of 4. And she's heard of so many other borrowers. Well, he says the opposite. He said he's seen thousands upon thousands, millions, or heard of millions of people, and only 1 borrower. So he, not very nicely, said that they're probably all gone, and she's alone. Would have upset me too. He wasn't thinking, was he? Especially if he wanted to make a friend. Well, we'll see what happens next with Soarietti and her family and the boy at the house as we continue the borrowers. See you next time.